Prologue. Nick Donovan's feet became lead weights as he forced them down the silent hallway. The smell irritated his nose. His breathing was shallow, his chest constricted. The knot in his stomach pulled tighter. He spotted the room ahead on his right, and his steps slowed. The door stood open, inviting him in. The silence mocked him. 8 years of silence. This was not the ending he had envisioned. He stepped inside, his breath catching in his chest. Machines buzzed. Tubes dripped liquids into her veins. He swallowed hard, bit his lip. She looked nothing like he remembered. Not that he'd expected her to. Red welts splattered over her exposed skin. Her closed eyes sat deep in dark sockets. The body that had once been so full of life had become a fragile shell. Nick forced himself to breathe. Silently, he thanked the God he wasn't sure he believed in, that she was asleep or unconscious. He had no idea how he would handle looking into her eyes. A nurse stepped in. She spotted him there, blinked in surprise, and smiled. "I see we have a visitor." He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Are you family?" the nurse asked. Nick choked out a reply. "I'm an old friend." The nurse watched him a moment, then moved to check the machines, keeping her alive. "She'd be pleased to know someone cared enough to come." "What do you mean?" "She's had no visitors since she was transferred here." "No one?" The nurse smiled sadly. "No one until you." He looked at her still body. His eyes watered despite his attempt at control. "Is she in a lot of pain?" The nurse eyed him carefully, her eyebrows knitted tightly together. "You do know she's in a coma?" Nick tried to swallow, but the dry lump in his throat wouldn't budge. "No, I didn't know." The nurse moved away from the bed. "She's not expected to pull out of it." He stared at her closed eyelids, shook his head, shivered. The nurse touched his shoulder and said, "But I believe she knows you're here, and that would mean a lot to her." The nurse left. Nick stood frozen, the flood of emotions causing physical pain. Finally, he pulled a chair beside her bed. He took her bony hand in his, and he remembered. Chapter 1. Nick Donovan drove the toe of his size 11 sneaker into the side of the empty cardboard box. It sailed through the air, hit the blank wall, and fell on top of a stack of more cardboard boxes. A dozen curses raced through his mind. He didn't voice any of them. What difference would it make? No one was around to hear him. More than a week had passed since he'd had any sort of human contact, unless he counted the pizza delivery guy. 16 days ago, he'd walked out of the Brevard County Courthouse, newly divorced and damn near broke. He'd gotten into his beat-up pickup truck, alone. Shelley had gotten into the passenger side of the Lexus that belonged to the man who used to be his best friend. He had traveled 125 miles to Tampa, to the hole-in-the-wall apartment he now called home. She'd traveled a few miles back to the 7-room, 2,500-square-foot ranch they'd once shared. And here he had sat, brooded and raged. He'd left his job, his friends, his life behind. 31 years old, and he was starting all over again. He just didn't know where or how to begin. With a heavy sigh, Nick grabbed his wallet and stepped out into the musty hallway. He imagined Shelley sitting in the jacuzzi, sipping champagne and laughing. He barely restrained himself from putting his fist through the glass pane of the outer door. He had to stop torturing himself and move on with his life.